I never believed in urban legends until I moved to Cedar Falls, Iowa, and heard about the Echo Children for the first time. The realtor hadn't mentioned them when she showed me the Victorian house on Elm Street. She'd talked about the original hardwood floors, the restored crown molding, the way afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows. She hadn't mentioned why the previous 3 families had moved out within 6 months of moving in. The neighbors filled me in during my first week. Mrs. Henderson from across the street brought me a casserole and a warning wrapped in neighborly concern. "You'll hear them at night," she said, setting the dish on my kitchen counter. "The Echo Children. They come around when someone new moves into that house." I laughed it off. Small-town folklore, I figured. Every old house has its ghost stories, its mysterious sounds that turn out to be settling foundations or mice in the walls. I'd lived in enough places to know that imagination fills in the blanks when you're alone in an unfamiliar space. The first night I heard them, I was unpacking boxes in the living room. The sound came from upstairs, children's laughter, bright and innocent, echoing through the empty rooms above me. My first thought was relief. Kids playing outside, their voices carrying through the old windows. Nothing supernatural about that. But when I stepped onto the front porch to look, the street was empty. Streetlights cast long shadows across abandoned sidewalks. No children anywhere. No sounds except the distant hum of traffic from the highway. Back inside, the laughter continued. Clearer now, coming from the room directly above me. I climbed the stairs, my footsteps creaking on the old wood. The sound stopped the moment I reached the second-floor landing. Every room was empty. No toys, no hiding places, no explanation for voices that had seemed so real just moments before. The next morning, I called Mrs. Henderson. "The Echo Children," she explained patiently, as if she'd had this conversation many times before. "They're not ghosts exactly, more like recordings, impressions left behind by all the children who used to live in that house." She told me the story then. How the house had been built in 1887 by the Ashford family, who'd raised 7 children within its walls. How it had passed through generations of families, each adding their own layer of childhood memories to the foundation. Birthday parties and Christmas mornings, summer afternoons, and bedtime stories. Decades of accumulated joy pressed into the wood and plaster like invisible photographs. "The house remembers," Mrs. Henderson said, "and sometimes when someone new moves in, it tries to share those memories. The children you hear aren't trying to scare you, they're just echoing." I wanted to believe her explanation. It was comforting in a way. The idea that happiness could leave such deep impressions that it literally became part of a place. But as the days passed, I began to notice things that didn't fit with her gentle ghost story. The laughter wasn't always joyful. Sometimes it carried undertones of desperation, of children calling out for someone who couldn't hear them. Sometimes it dissolved into sobbing that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. And sometimes, late at night, I heard different voices entirely. Adult voices, harsh and angry, cutting through the children's echoes like static through a radio broadcast. These voices spoke in fragments, incomplete sentences that made my skin crawl. "Won't tell anyone, will you? If you're very quiet." Our little secret. I started researching the house's history at the Cedar Falls Historical Society. Public records showed the standard pattern of ownership changes, births, and deaths. Nothing unusual, but newspaper archives told a different story. Missing children reports from the 1920s, a family court case from 1954 that ended with children being removed from the home, police reports from the 1970s about domestic disturbances that were never fully explained. The pattern became clear. Not all the children who had lived in that house had been happy. Not all the memories pressed into its walls were celebrations of childhood innocence. Some were records of things that should never have happened, preserved in the structure like evidence in amber. The house wasn't sharing joyful memories, it was confessing. 2 weeks after moving in, I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of a child screaming. Not laughter this time, not play, pure terror, echoing through the house with an urgency that sent me stumbling down the hallway in my pajamas. The screaming came from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off walls and ceiling in a cacophony of desperate pleas. I followed the sound to the basement door. I'd avoided the basement since moving in. It was unfinished, full of shadows and cobwebs, the kind of space that belonged in horror movies. But the screaming was coming from down there, getting louder as I approached. The wooden steps groaned under my weight. The basement was exactly as dark and unwelcoming as I'd expected, filled with forgotten furniture and boxes left by previous owners. But in the corner, barely visible in the light from my phone's flashlight, I saw something that stopped my heart. Child-sized handprints pressed into the concrete wall, dozens of them layer upon layer, as if generations of small hands had pushed against that surface trying to get out. Some prints were large enough to belong to teenagers. Others were impossibly small, the kind left by toddlers barely old enough to walk. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by whispers that seemed to come from the handprints themselves. "He's here now," they said in unison. "He can hear us. He can help." I understood then why families kept moving out. The Echo children weren't trying to scare anyone away. They were trying to tell their stories to someone who would listen, someone who might finally understand what had happened in that house across the decades. But understanding came with responsibility. Once you heard their voices clearly, once you saw the evidence they'd left behind, you became part of their echo. You became another layer in the house's memory, another witness to secrets that should have been reported generations ago. I moved out the next week, but it didn't matter. The children's voices followed me. They echo in every house I've lived in since, reminding me that some stories demand to be told, no matter how long they've been buried. The house on Elm Street is still for sale. It goes on the market every few months when new owners realize they can't handle what they've inherited. The Echo children are still there, waiting for someone who will listen to their complete story. Someone brave enough to make the calls that should have been made decades ago. Every small town in New England has its founding myth. Some story about brave settlers, harsh winters, and the triumph of community spirit over adversity. Millbrook, Massachusetts, was no different. According to the brass plaque in the town square, the settlement was established in 1693 by refugees from the Salem witch trials, who sought a place where they could practice their faith without persecution. What the plaque didn't mention was why those refugees chose this particular valley, or what they found when they arrived. I learned the real story when I took a job as the town historian, tasked with organizing the municipal records in preparation for Millbrook's 330th anniversary celebration. The first hint that something was off came in a letter dated October 15, 1693, written by the settlement's leader, Jeremiah Whitmore, to his brother in Boston. The letter was filed with other historical documents, yellowed with age but perfectly preserved in the town hall's climate-controlled archives. "We have made contact with the original inhabitants," Whitmore wrote in his careful script. "They are not as we expected, but they are willing to share this place with us under certain conditions. The arrangement requires careful maintenance but ensures peace for all parties involved." I assumed he was referring to local Native American tribes, though no other records mentioned any negotiations with indigenous peoples. But as I dug deeper into the archives, I found more letters, each more cryptic than the last. From Whitmore's journal, dated November 3, 1693, "The protocols must be followed exactly. Margaret Thorne nearly broke the arrangement today by allowing her child to wander past the designated boundaries after sunset. The consequences were educational. Young Timothy returned unharmed, but changed. He speaks now of things beneath the earth, of watchers in the forest. We have counseled the family on proper adherence to the rules. From a town meeting transcript, December 1693. It is agreed that no resident shall venture into the woods between the hours of sunset and sunrise without proper accompaniment from designated protectors. Any violation of this protocol endangers not just the individual, but the entire settlement. The original inhabitants have been patient with our learning process, but their patience has limits. I spent weeks trying to piece together what these protocols entailed. The early records were frustratingly vague, full of references to arrangements and understandings without specifics. But gradually, a pattern emerged. Millbrook had been built according to very specific rules. Streets laid out in particular patterns, buildings constructed at precise angles, certain areas marked as permanently off-limits. The town's peculiar layout, which had always seemed like quaint New England eccentricity, was actually a carefully designed system of boundaries and barriers. The Millbrook Cemetery provided the clearest clues. Unlike typical colonial graveyards, it was arranged in concentric circles around a central area that contained no graves at all. Just empty ground, carefully maintained but never disturbed. Local tradition said it was reserved for future expansion, but after 3 centuries, no one had ever been buried there. The headstones themselves told their own story. Many bore death dates, but no birth dates, as if the deceased had simply appeared in Millbrook fully formed. Others showed impossible lifespans, people who had supposedly lived for over a century during a time when such longevity was virtually unheard of. But it was the pattern of deaths that really caught my attention. Every 7 years, without exception, Millbrook experienced a cluster of fatalities. Always the same number, 13 deaths within a single month, always in October, always under circumstances that were never fully explained in official records. The most recent cluster had occurred 7 years before my arrival. 13 residents, ranging in age from newborn to elderly, had died within the span of 3 weeks. The local newspaper had reported them as separate incidents, heart attacks, accidents, sudden illnesses, but the timing was too precise to be coincidental. I began interviewing longtime residents, carefully probing for information about the town's traditions and unspoken rules. Most were reluctant to discuss anything unusual, but patterns emerged from their careful words. No one went into the woods alone, ever. Certain streets were avoided after dark. The old Whitmore house at the end of Elm Street had been vacant for decades, not because it was haunted, but because it served as what people called a transition point. Mrs. Abernathy, whose family had lived in Millbrook for 9 generations, finally provided the context I needed. We were sitting in her kitchen sharing tea and discussing the upcoming anniversary celebration when she noticed my research notes spread across her table. "You've been asking a lot of questions," she said quietly. "There are things about this town that don't get written down in official histories." She told me about the Millbrook Protocol, passed down through generations of selected families, how the original settlers hadn't displaced the previous inhabitants, but had instead negotiated a coexistence agreement. The previous inhabitants weren't human, exactly, but they weren't malevolent either. They were simply different, ancient. They had their own needs, their own territorial requirements. The protocol maintained the balance, specific behaviors, seasonal observances, and yes, occasional offerings to maintain the peace. 13 lives every 7 years, chosen according to criteria that were never fully explained, but always accepted by the community. "It sounds horrible," Mrs. Abernathy said, reading my expression. "But consider the alternative. Salem burned its witches and suffered decades of guilt and trauma. Millbrook found a different solution. We've had 3 centuries of peace, prosperity, and protection. No wars have touched us. No disasters have struck us. No outside threats have ever successfully penetrated our boundaries." The anniversary celebration was scheduled for October 15th, exactly 7 years after the last cluster of deaths. As the date approached, I noticed changes in the town's atmosphere. Residents became more withdrawn, more careful in their movements. Families started keeping their children indoors after sunset. The old protocols were quietly being reinforced. 3 days before the celebration, I found a letter on my desk at the town hall. No postmark, no signature, written in the same careful script as Jeremiah Whitmore's correspondence from 3 centuries ago. "The arrangement continues," it read. 13 volunteers ensure another 7 years of peace. The selection process has begun. Your research has been noted and appreciated. Consider it an application for participation. That night, I heard them for the first time. Footsteps on the streets outside my apartment, moving in patterns that followed no human logic. Voices speaking in languages that predated English colonization. Sounds from the forest that belonged to no animal I could identify. I understood then what the original settlers had discovered. Millbrook existed in a space between worlds, a place where different forms of life could coexist as long as certain rules were followed. The protocol wasn't about worship or submission. It was about maintaining a delicate ecological balance that benefited both species. The 13 who died every 7 years weren't victims. They were volunteers, chosen through processes I was only beginning to understand. They became part of the arrangement itself, joining the original inhabitants in their stewardship of the valley. On October 15th, 2023, I attended Millbrook's 330th anniversary celebration. 13 residents were honored for their volunteer service to the community, though none of them appeared to be present at the ceremony. Their chairs sat empty at the head table, while the mayor gave a speech about the importance of sacrifice for the greater good. That night, as I packed my belongings to leave town, I heard the footsteps again. But this time, they stopped outside my door. A letter slid underneath, written in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. "The arrangement is acceptable," it read. "Welcome to the protocol." I never finished my research on Millbrook's history. Some stories are meant to be lived rather than documented. The town celebrates its 337th anniversary next year, and 13 new volunteers will be selected to maintain the peace. If you're looking for a quiet place to settle down, Millbrook is always welcoming to new residents, especially those with an appreciation for tradition and community service. Children adapt faster than adults realize. What starts as innocent playground entertainment can evolve, spread, and transform within a single recess period. As a school counselor at Lincoln Elementary in suburban Portland, Oregon, I'd seen countless variations of tag, hide and seek, and pretend games that morphed as they passed from child to child. But I'd never seen anything like the whisper game until it appeared during the 3rd week of October, spreading through the 4th and 5th grades like a virus engineered specifically for developing minds. The first time I noticed it, 7 children were huddled together near the edge of the playground, their heads bent in concentration. They stood in a perfect circle, hands clasped, lips moving in silent synchronization. From a distance, it looked like a prayer circle or meditation exercise, something their teachers might have introduced as a mindfulness activity. But there was something about their absolute stillness, the way they breathed in perfect unison, that made me pause. I approached casually, pretending to supervise the nearby swing set while I listened. The children weren't praying. They were whispering names. Real names, full names, complete with addresses and personal details that made my skin crawl. They knew where their classmates lived, what their parents did for work, which windows faced their bedrooms. Information no child should possess about their peers. Emma Richardson, 1247 Oak Street, second floor corner room. Parents work late on Thursdays, whispered Madison, a shy fifth grader who rarely spoke in class. Tyler Chen, 885 Maple Avenue, afraid of the dark, sleeps with his door open, added another child, her voice flat and emotionless. When the lunch bell rang, they broke their circle and scattered as if nothing had happened. But throughout the afternoon, I noticed them exchanging glances, small nods of acknowledgement, like members of a secret society confirming their shared purpose. That evening, I called Emma Richardson's mother. Just a routine check-in about her daughter's progress, I explained. But I worked in questions about home security, whether Emma had mentioned feeling watched or followed. Mrs. Richardson's voice tightened. "It's funny you should ask," she said. "Emma's been having nightmares about someone standing outside her bedroom window. She insists she can see a face in the glass, watching her sleep. We've checked multiple times, but there's never anyone there." Over the next week, the whisper game spread. More children joined the circles, and the information they shared became increasingly detailed. They knew which families left their doors unlocked, which houses had alarm systems, which parents checked on their children before going to bed. But it wasn't the surveillance that worried me most. It was the way the participating children began to change. They became quieter in class, more withdrawn from their usual social groups. Their artwork shifted from typical childish themes to disturbing images of empty houses and darkened windows. During free reading time, they gravitated toward books about hiding, about secret places, about things that moved unseen through familiar spaces. I tried intervening directly, asking individual children about the game, but they looked at me with blank expressions, as if they had no idea what I was talking about. The whisper game only existed during recess, and only for those who had been invited to participate. The first incident occurred on a Thursday night in early November. The Hendersons called the police to report someone standing in their backyard, staring up at their 8-year-old son's bedroom window. By the time officers arrived, the figure was gone. No footprints in the soft earth below the window. No evidence that anyone had been there at all. But young Jacob Henderson insisted he'd seen a face in the glass. A child's face, pale and expressionless, watching him sleep. The next day at school, Jacob joined the whisper game circle. I realized then that this wasn't traditional playground bullying or even elaborate pranks. The children in the circles weren't sharing information they'd gathered through normal means. They were somehow connected to whatever was visiting these houses, these bedrooms, these private moments that should have been safe from outside observation. The game was a recruitment tool. Children who were visited became part of the network, adding their own whispered intelligence to the collective knowledge base. And with each new participant, the circle's understanding of the community's vulnerabilities grew more complete. I started staying late at school, watching from my office window as the children gathered for their afternoon sessions. The circles were getting larger. What had started with 7 participants now included nearly 24 children from multiple grade levels. They stood in concentric rings, the newest members on the outside, the original participants at the center. And at the very center, barely visible between the taller children, was something that didn't belong. A figure too small to be a student, too still to be human. It stood perfectly motionless while the children whispered their intelligence reports, occasionally nodding as if approving the information being shared. I tried photographing them through my office window, but every image came out distorted, as if the camera couldn't properly focus on whatever occupied the center of their circle. Videos showed only empty space where I could clearly see the diminutive figure directing the children's activities. The break came when I overheard Madison talking to her best friend during lunch. She was describing the whisper game in terms that made my blood freeze. "It's like hide and seek, but backwards," she explained. "Instead of hiding from the seeker, we help it find everyone else. We tell it where people sleep, when they're alone, how to get inside their houses without being seen. And if we're really good helpers, we get to play the special version." "What's the special version?" her friend asked. Madison smiled, but it wasn't a child's smile. It was something ancient wearing a child's expression. "We get to go visiting." That night, I drove through the neighborhoods where my students lived, looking for signs of the watchers. What I found was worse than I'd expected. Small figures standing motionless in yards, peering through windows, testing doors and windows with movements too deliberate to be natural. But the figures weren't quite human. They moved like children, but their proportions were slightly wrong. Arms too long, heads too large, fingers that bent in directions that suggested too many joints. In the darkness, they looked enough like lost kids that concerned adults might approach them, might invite them inside. The whisper game wasn't teaching children to spy on their neighbors. It was teaching them to scout for something that wore childhood as a disguise, something that needed detailed intelligence about human habits and vulnerabilities to successfully infiltrate our most private spaces. I called the police, but how do you report playground activities that technically involve no illegal behavior? How do you explain that children sharing information about their classmates represented a threat to community safety? The answer came when one of the participating children went missing. Sarah Mitchell, age 9, disappeared from her bedroom on a Tuesday night in mid-November. Her parents found her window open, screen carefully removed, and set aside. No signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry. Sarah had simply vanished, leaving behind only a note written in her own handwriting. "Gone to play the special version. Don't look for me." The next day at school, Sarah's empty desk became the center of a new whisper game circle. The children stood around it during recess, heads bowed, lips moving in silent prayer or incantation. But when I approached to investigate, they scattered before I could hear what they were saying. That afternoon, I received a call from Sarah's mother. Sarah had returned home, but something was wrong. She looked exactly the same, spoke in the same voice, remembered all the family details that proved her identity. But she moved differently, watched people with an intensity that was unsettling, asked questions about neighbors and family friends that seemed designed to gather intelligence rather than satisfy childhood curiosity. "She's my daughter," Mrs. Mitchell said, her voice breaking. "But she's not my daughter. Does that make sense?" It made perfect sense. The whisper game had been preparing for this, gathering information about children who could be replaced, learning enough about their personalities and relationships to make the substitution seamless. Sarah Mitchell had been recruited for the special version of the game, and something wearing her face had been sent back in her place. But the true horror wasn't just the replacement, it was the systematic nature of it all. Over the following weeks, I watched as more children disappeared for single nights, returning subtly different. Parents reported minor behavioral changes, slight alterations in speech patterns, unusual questions about family routines and neighborhood layouts. The entities behind the whisper game weren't randomly selecting victims. They were conducting a careful study of human family structures, learning to mimic us so perfectly that even parents couldn't detect the difference. Each replaced child became a sleeper agent, gathering intelligence for future operations, while maintaining their cover as normal suburban kids. The game continued to spread to other schools in the district. I tried warning other counselors, but my reports were dismissed as paranoid delusions. The replaced children were too perfect, too normal in every way that mattered to administrators and teachers. Their grades remained stable. Their social interactions appeared healthy. Their behavior fell well within acceptable parameters. But I knew the truth. The whisper game had evolved from a recruitment tool into a full-scale invasion protocol. What had started as children sharing secrets on a playground had become the systematic infiltration of human society, one family at a time. I left Lincoln Elementary at the end of that school year, but I continue to monitor reports of unusual playground activities in schools across the country. The whisper game has adapted to local conditions, incorporating regional folklore and established playground traditions as camouflage for its true purpose. If your child comes home talking about whisper games, about circles where children share secrets, about special versions of playground activities, listen carefully. Ask specific questions about who organizes these games, who stands in the center of the circles, who decides which children get to play the special versions. And if your child disappears for even a single night, pay attention when they return. Look for changes in behavior, in speech patterns, in the way they watch you when they think you're not looking. The invasion has already begun, and it's using our own children as the entry point. The whisper game is patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless in its efficiency. By the time parents notice something is wrong, it's already too late. The entities don't need to conquer us through force or intimidation. They're replacing us, one whispered secret at a time, until there's nothing left of humanity but perfectly maintained facades housing alien intelligence. The children are still playing their games at recess. The circles are still forming on playgrounds across the country. And somewhere in the center of each circle, something that isn't quite human is learning everything it needs to know about becoming us. Thanks for listening to these spine-chilling tales. If these stories kept you on the edge of your seat, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more exciting content. Leave a comment below and let me know which story gave you the most chills. I love hearing from other horror lovers. Until next time, sleep tight if you can.